Hey there, deep divers. Ready to jump into something epic?
Always.
Awesome. Today, we're diving into biblical covenants.
Oh, fascinating stuff.
Yeah, we got some great excerpts from a talk by this guy, David Pawson. You folks sent them in.
I've heard of him. Really insightful perspectives.
He basically lays out how these ancient agreements still impact us today. Faith, history, even the future.
It's amazing how he connects the dots, He shows how God's plan unfolds through these covenants.
Exactly. And get this, he focuses on 5 key ones and how they contrast, old and new. Gives you the big picture.
Right. It's not your typical Bible study, that's for sure. And some of the questions he raises really make you think, like, did you know there are actually more laws in the New Testament than the Old?
Seriously. Blew my mind when I first heard that. Challenges everything you think you know about the Bible, right?
For sure. Makes you realize there's always more to discover.
Okay, so before we get too far ahead, let's break it down. What exactly are we talking about when we say covenants in, biblical terms?
It's more than just a simple agreement or contract. Think of it as a binding promise. God initiates it, and it's a huge EG deal for humanity.
Okay, so it's a serious commitment, not just a handshake deal.
Exactly. It sets the stage for everything that follows.
I'm starting to see how this goes way beyond a history lesson.
Oh, yeah. This is about understanding the very foundations of our faith.
So where do we start with all this?
Well, Pawson kicks things off with those big, overarching covenants like the Noahic and the Abrahamic ones.
Global in scope, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Affecting everyone. They show God's concern for all of humanity.
Okay, so it starts big picture, but then things shift, right?
Right. We move from the universal to a national focus, specifically on the Israelites. That's where the Mosaic Covenant comes in.
Ah, the Mosaic Covenant. That one's got a bit of a reputation, right?
It does. All those rules and regulations. But it's actually super important. It establishes a unique relationship between God and the Israelites. Sets them apart.
So it's about more than just following the rules.
It's about identity, becoming a holy people, reflecting God's character. But there's a catch. It's conditional. Blessings for obedience, curses for disobedience.
Now, so there are consequences.
That's
high stakes.
Definitely. And Pawson really drives that home. He talks about the blessings and curses outlined in Deuteronomy 28. No sugarcoating it.
Give us some examples. What kind of blessings and curses are we talking about?
We're talking abundance, prosperity, victory in battle, you name it, for obedience. But disobedience. Disease, famine, defeat, even exile.
Wow, those are pretty extreme opposites.
And Pawson makes this really thought-provoking connection between the curses and, even events like the Holocaust.
He's suggesting that was a consequence of disobedience.
In a way, yes. A result of choices made over centuries.
Heavy stuff. Shows how seriously God takes his covenant. But did he, just sit back and wait to see how it played out?
Not exactly. Pawson points to this concept of the land Sabbath. God commanded the Israelites to let their land rest every 7th year.
Interesting. Why was that?
It was about acknowledging God's ownership of the land, their dependence on him. Plus, it helped the land replenish, sustainability for future generations.
Makes sense. But did they actually follow this?
Not consistently, no. Pawson explains they ignored it for centuries.
So, racking up a debt.
Exactly. And that disregard, that failure to honor God's command, it eventually led to the Babylonian exile.
Whoa, they got evicted for not giving the land a break.
You could say that. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Even though there was exile, God remained faithful. He promised to bring them back to the land.
And did that happen?
It did. And Pawson points out something amazing. He links the increasing rainfall in modern Israel to the growing number of Jews returning, like a divine connection.
Wow, it's like God's preparing the land, showing his faithfulness to his promises.
Precisely. But as we move forward, it's important to remember the Mosaic Covenant doesn't tell the whole story.
Right, because we can't just directly apply Old Testament laws to New Testament believers. Like Pawson's example of the preacher misusing Malachi to talk about tithing.
Yeah. Important point. Some principles carry over, but many of those specific laws and rituals just don't apply to Christians today.
So we don't have to follow all those ancient rules? What a relief. I mean, I like my clothes with mixed fabrics.
Exactly. The point is, context matters. The Mosaic Covenant had a specific purpose for a specific people at a specific time. The story keeps unfolding.
Which brings us to a question I'm sure our listeners are thinking. What does it mean to under the law of Christ? What are those, 1,100 plus commandments Pawson mentioned?
Great question. And that leads us into the next chapter of this epic saga. The Mosaic covenant lays a foundation, but the Davidic covenant, well, that takes us in a whole new direction.
Okay, so we're moving from laws and land to royalty. This Davidic covenant sounds kind of fancy.
It is. It shifts the focus. We're not just looking at the nation of Israel as a whole now, but specifically at King David's line, his descendants.
Ah, so like a royal family, a dynasty.
Exactly. God promises an ongoing line of kings ruling over his people.
But didn't Pawson say something pretty bold about this? Something like democracy is not God's idea.
He did. It's a thought-provoking statement, for sure. He contrasts kingdoms and democracies, you know?
Yeah, how so?
Well, in a kingdom, ideally, you have one ruler who embodies both the authority and the responsibility.
So no messy elections or anything?
Nope. The king has the final say, makes the laws, ensures justice. It can be pretty efficient, actually.
Sounds kind of peaceful.
In a way, yeah. But of course, there's a downside. The fate of everyone rests on the character of that one king.
Ah, right. A good king, things are great. A bad king, not so much.
Exactly. And if you look at Israel's history, they had their share of both.
Oh, yeah. Tons of stories about good kings, bad kings. It's a whole thing.
But here's the fascinating part about the Davidic covenant. It's not just about those earthly kings. There's a bigger promise woven in.
Like a double meaning?
You could say that. It points to an eternal king, someone who would come from David's line, but who would rule forever.
Wait, so it's not jesty about guys in crowns and fancy robes?
Nope. Ultimately, the Davidic covenant points to Jesus, the ultimate son of David, the King of Kings.
Mm-hmm.
His kingdom isn't limited to one nation or time period.
So all those kings were like setting the stage for Jesus, like a preview.
Exactly. It's all part of this incredible plan unfolding through history. And it makes you think, doesn't it? Like, would you want to live in a kingdom today?
It's a wild thought,
Yeah.
especially in our modern world. I mean, we value democracy, voting, all that. But it's interesting to consider what submitting to a truly good king would be like.
Right. One who is perfectly just, perfectly loving. That's what the Davidic covenant ultimately points to.
Okay, I'm starting to see how it all ties together. So we've got these foundational covenants, the Noahic, Abrahamic, Mosaic. They lay the groundwork. Then the Davidic covenant adds this layer of kingship, pointing towards Jesus.
And that brings us to the heart of it all. The new covenant. This is where Jesus takes everything to a whole new level.
Okay, so we've got the old and busted covenants.
Yeah.
What makes this new covenant so new and improved?
Oh, it's a game changer. Not just a tweak to the system, it's a complete overhaul. And it was foretold, you know. Prophets like Jeremiah, Isaiah, they talked about it centuries before Jesus.
So it was like a long time coming. People were anticipating this.
Absolutely. And when Jesus arrives, he makes it clear. He's establishing a new W covenant, fulfilling those old promises, but also bringing something radically different.
Okay, I'm on the edge of my seat here. What's so different? What sets it apart?
Pawson breaks it down beautifully. He talks about inclination first.
Inclination, like what we're naturally drawn to.
Exactly. The new covenant promises a changed heart, a deep inner transformation. It's not about following rules out of obligation anymore.
So no more, I should do this, but I want to do this.
Exactly. It's a new nature, a heart that delights in God's ways.
Sign me up.
Yeah.
That sounds way better than constantly battling my own desires.
Right. It's like this burden is lifted. And Pawson goes on to talk about intimacy.
Whoa, intimacy with God. What does that even look like?
He uses this beautiful analogy of a married couple, you know, one that's been together for years. They just know each other so well, they can sense what the other is feeling without a word.
Oh, I get it. Like that deep connection where you just get each other.
Exactly. That's what the new covenant offers us with God, this closeness, this understanding of his heart.
So it's not just knowing about God, it's like knowing him personally.
Precisely. It's a relationship built on trust, on shared experience. And then Pawson adds another element, innocence.
Innocence.
Wow.
But we still sin, right? Even as Christians.
Of course, we're human. But what Pawson's talking about is that complete forgiveness we receive through Jesus. He tells this story about a woman who couldn't forgive herself, even though God already had.
Oh, well, I've felt that way before. Like stuck in guilt, even when you know you're forgiven.
That's what the new covenant breaks. It frees us from that burden, from the shame. We can experience true innocence in God's presence.
Okay, that's incredibly freeing. So under the new covenant, we have this new nature, this deep intimacy with God, and this freedom from guilt. It's like a total package.
It is, and it's all made possible through Jesus. He's the one who fulfills those seemingly contradictory roles Isaiah talked about, supreme sovereign and suffering servant.
Right. That was tripping me up earlier. How could he be both?
It's a paradox that a lot of people in Jesus' time struggled with, too. They were expecting a conquering king, someone to overthrow the Romans, you know. They couldn't reconcile that with a suffering savior.
So how does it fit together?
Jesus fulfills both roles, but in two different comings. The first time, he came humbly to deal with sin, to offer salvation. The second time, well, that's when he'll return as the reigning king.
Ah, I get it.
Yeah.
So the suffering servant paves the way for the supreme sovereign.
Exactly. Two sides of the same coin, two acts in the same play, each revealing a different part of his mission.
Okay, that's actually pretty brilliant. So first he comes to redeem us, then he comes back to rule.
That's it. And that brings us to Pawson's story about the United Nations prayer room. Have you heard about this?
The black block, right? Someone mentioned it before we started recording.
Yeah. It's this plain black block in the middle of the room, meant to represent all the gods of the world. People of different faiths can look at it and pray for peace.
Interesting concept. But I get the feeling Pawson sees something deeper in that.
Oh, absolutely. He uses it to make a powerful point. We can't just wish peace into existence, playing to a black block, hoping for a better world. It's not going to solve the root problems.
So like ignoring the real issues while putting on a show of unity.
You got it. Pawson argues that true lasting peace comes only through Jesus' reign, when justice and righteousness prevail. And that brings us to the big question for us today. What does this mean for how do we live?
Okay, so we've explored these covenants, God's promises to humanity, leading up to the new covenant. You know, new heart, close relationship with God, total forgiveness. But now I'm thinking, how does this actually play out in our lives? Like, we're not ancient Israelites waiting for a king to show up. So what does it mean to be covenant people in the 21st century?
That's the question, isn't it? It's easy to get caught up in the theology and miss the practical application. But Pawson, he doesn't let us off the hook. Remember that black block story?
Yeah, the one at the UN. I'm still kind of processing that.
It's powerful, right? He's basically saying we can't just will peace into being. Praying for a better world while ignoring injustice. It's like expecting that black block to magically fix everything.
So you're saying our efforts to make the world better are pointless. Just sit back and wait for Jesus to take care of it.
Not at all. It's about execution, but the right kind of action. Remember, the new covenant. It's about more than just us getting saved. It's about the renewal of everything.
So we're part of that. We're supposed to be renewing things.
Exactly. We're agents of that renewal, reflecting God's character and how we live, how we treat others, how we engage with the world.
So instead of just waiting for a king to come set up his kingdom, or like showing what that kingdom looks like, NWB.
You got it. Think about those key elements. Inclination, intimacy, innocence. When our hearts are changed, when we're deeply connected to God, when we're living in that freedom of forgiveness, it impacts everything.
It's like the change starts inside us and then it spills out.
Right. We're not trying to force the world into some mold. We're living out a different way of being. It's not about imposing our will, but reflecting God's will in our relationships, our work, even how we care for the environment.
Right.
It's all connected.
Whoa, okay. This is making me rethink a lot of things. Like if I'm being patient with my kids, is that really reflecting God's kingdom? Or ignoring injustice because it's easier to look away?
Tough questions, right? But Pawson doesn't give us easy answers. He talks about this tension we live in between the already and the not yet. Jesus' kingdom, here, in a sense. But the fullness of it, his return as king, that's still coming. So we live in this in-between space, called to be faithful now.
That tension is real. I feel it all the time. Like, should I be doing more to fix things, or should I just trust God to handle it?
It's a balance, and it looks different for everyone, depending on our gifts or situations. The key is staying connected to the source, to God. That's what empowers us to be his hands and feet in the world.
So maybe instead of getting stuck on what's the right thing to do, we should ask, am I connected to the one who is right?
Love that, because it's out of that connection that everything else flows. Love, joy, peace, patience. Those are the signs of God's kingdom, and they come from abiding in him.
Okay, this is some deep stuff. It's not just about doing good things. It's about being transformed so those good things flow naturally.
Exactly. It's not about earning our way into God's kingdom. It's about letting his kingdom transform us from the inside out. And when that happens, we become the answer to the question, what does it look like to live as a covenant person today?
Wow, that's powerful. This whole deep dive has been amazing. We've covered so much, from ancient history to modern challenges, and it's honestly made me think differently about how I live, how we interact with the world, what it means to follow Jesus.
It's been a privilege to explore these ideas with you and with our listeners. I hope this sparks a desire to go even deeper, to really grasp what these covenants mean and how they can shape our lives.
Yeah, this is more than just head knowledge. This is heart-changing stuff. We hope you, our listener, are walking away not just informed, but inspired. Let these ancient agreements ignite that passion to reflect God's kingdom right here, right now, in a world that needs it so badly.
Amen to that. Keep diving into God's word. Keep seeking his heart. And until next time.
Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive. Remember, the journey of faith is always better together.